53. So glad was the worthy Earl Magnus, as though he were bidden to a feast. He neither spoke with hate nor words of wrath. And after this talk he fell to prayer, and hid his face in the palms of his hands, and shed out many tears before God's eyesight. When Earl Magnus the Saint was done to death, Hakon bade Ulfike his banner-bearer to slay the Earl, but he said nay with the greatest wrath. Then he forced Leif his cook to kill Magnus, but began to weep aloud. "Thou shalt not weep for this," said the Earl, "for that there is fame in doing such deeds. Be steadfast in thy heart, for thou shalt have my clothes, as is the wont and law of men of old and thy will, and he who forces thee misdoes more than thou." But when the Earl had said this, he threw off his kirtle and gave it to Leif. After that he begged leave to say his prayers, and that was granted him. He fell to earth, and gave himself over to God, and brought himself as an offering to him. He not only prayed for himself or his friends, but rather there and then for his foes and benemen, and forgave them with all his heart what they had missed in towards him, and confessed his own misdeeds to God, and prayed that they might be washed off him by the outshedding of his blood, and commended his soul into God's hand, and prayed that God's angels would come to meet his soul, and bear it into the rest of paradise. Some men say that he took the Lord's body when the Mass was sung to him. When the friend of God was led out to slaughter, he spoke to Leif, "Stand thou before me, and hew me on my head a great wound, for it beseems not to chop off chiefs' heads like thieves. Strengthen thyself, wretched man, for I have prayed for thee to God that he may have mercy on thee." After that he signed himself, and bowed himself to the stroke, and his spirit passed to heaven. 54. That spot was before mossy and stony. But in a little after the worthiness of Earl Magnus before God was so bright that there sprung up a green sward where he was slain, and God showed that he was slain for righteousness' sake, and inherited the fairness and greenness of paradise, which is called the earth of living men. Earl Hakon did not allow the Earl to be born to the church. The death day of Earl Magnus is 2 nights after Tiborsmass. He had then been Earl over the Orkney 7 winters, he and Hakon both together. There had then passed since the fall of King Olaf 74 winters. Sigurd and Eystein and Olaf were the kings over Norway. There had been passed since the birth of Christ 1091 winters. 55. After the meeting, Thora, the mother of Earl Magnus, had bidden both earls to a feast, and now came Earl Hakon to the feast after the slaying of Earl Magnus the Saint. Thora went about waiting on the guests herself, and bore drink to the Earl and his men, those who had been at the slaying of her son. And when the drink took hold of the Earl, then Thora went before him and said, "Now art thou come hither alone, Lord, but I looked for you both. Wilt thou now gladden me before the witness of God and men? Be now to me in a son's stead, and I will be to thee in a mother's stead. I much need now thy pity, and that thou givest me leave that my son may be born to church. Be now so with me in my prayers as thou oldest wish God to be with thee at doomsday." The Earl holds his peace and thinks over the matter, and was sorry for those ill deeds when she begged so meekly with tears that she might have her way about bearing her son to church. He looked at her, and dropped tears, and said to her, "Bury thy son where it pleases thee." After that Earl Magnus was born to Hrossi, and buried at that Christ Church in Bursay which Earl Thorfinn made the make. Straightway after that a heavenly light was often seen shining over his grave. Afterwards men began to call upon him often, if they were placed in danger, and their matter was granted at once as they prayed. In the same way a heavenly fragrance was often perceived at his grave, and sick men got back their health thence. Then next men made journeys thither both from the Orkneys and Shetland, who were in weak health, and watched at the tomb of Earl Magnus the Saint, and got healing for their ailments. But yet men did not dare to spread this abroad while Earl Hakon lived. It is also so said that those men who were most in the treachery against Earl Magnus the Saint, most of them died ill and harrowing deaths. At that time William was bishop in the Orkneys. He was the first bishop there. The bishop's seat was then at Christchurch in Bursay. William was bishop 66 years. He doubted long the holiness of Earl Magnus. After the slaying of Earl Magnus, Haakon took all the realm under him in the Orkneys. He then made all men take an oath to him who had before served Earl Magnus. Then he became a great chief, and laid heavy burdens on the friends of Earl Magnus, whom he thought had been most against him in their quarrels. But some winters after, Haakon began his voyage out of the land, and fared south to Rome. In that journey he fared out to Jerusalem, thence he sought the Holidims, and bathed in the river Jordan, as is Palmer's wont. After that he turned back to his own land, and took under him the realm in the Orkneys. He then became a good ruler, and kept his realm well at peace. Then he set up in the Orkneys new laws, which pleased the freemen much better than those that had been before. With such things his friendships began to grow. And so it came about that the Orkneyingers cared for nothing else than to have Haakon for their chief, and his offspring after him. 56. At that time, when Earl Haakon had rule in the Orkneys, that man dwelt at the dale in Caithness whose name was Modin, a man of rank and very wealthy. His daughters were these, Helga and Freycock and Thorleif. Helga, Modin's daughter, was the concubine of Earl Haakon, and their son was Harald, who was called the Smooth-tongued, but their daughter was Ingebjorg, whom Olaf Beitling the Southern Isle king had to wife, and Margaret was also their daughter. Freycock, Modin's daughter, was given away to that man in Sutherland, whose name was Ljot the Dastard, and their daughter was Stiengvar the Stout, whom Thorljot in Rackwick had to wife. Their sons were Oliver the Unruly and Magnus, and Orm, and Modin and Eindride, and Odildwaith their daughter. Another daughter of Freycock was Gudrun, whom Thorstein the freeman, Driblimuth, had to wife. Their son was Thorbjorn the clerk. Thorleif, Moddan's daughter, had also a daughter whose name was Gunhilda. Odild, Earl Haakon had also another son, whose name was Paul, and was called Hold Tongue. He was gloomy, but had many friends. Between those brothers there was never much love lost when they grew up. Earl Haakon Paul's son was smitten to death by sickness there in the Isles, and men thought that great scathe, for at the end of his days there was good peace. But the freemen misdoubted much whether those brothers, Paul and Harald, would be of one mind. 57. After the death of Earl Haakon, his sons took the rule, and they were soon of two minds, and shared the realm into halves. There soon arose great divisions among the great men, and the chieftains threw themselves very much into two sides. Earl Harold held Caithness from the Scot king, and he was almost always there, but sometimes he was up in Scotland, for he had there many kinsmen and friends. When Earl Harold was seated in Sutherland, there came to him that man whose name was Sigurd, who was said to be the son of Ethelbert the priest. He was called Snapdeacon. He came down then from Scotland, and had been with David the Scot king, and he had laid upon him great honors. Earl Harold gave him a very hearty welcome. Sigurd fared out to the Orkneys with Earl Harold, and so did Freycock, Modin's daughter, for that Ljot the Dastard, her husband was then dead. She and her sister Helga had then a great share in ruling the land with Earl Harold. Sigurd Snap was in great love with all of them. Then Odild the daughter of Thorleif, Modin's daughter, followed him as his leman, and their daughter was Ingigerd, whom Haakon Claw afterwards had to wife. Eric the Straight had before had Odild to wife. Their son was Eric Stabrails. When they, Sigurd and Freycock, came into the Isles, a great thundering of followers arose, and each of the earls gathered as many of his friends about him as he could. These were dearest to Earl Paul, Sigurd of Westness, who had to wife Ingebjorg the Honourable, the earl's kinswoman, and Thorkel Summerald's son, who was always with Earl Paul, and was called Fosterer. He was near of kin to Magnus the Saint, and was more beloved of his friends than any man. Now the friends of Earl Harold deemed that Thorkel would be the last man to spare those brothers strife for the sake of those griefs which he had suffered from Earl Hakon their father. So it came about at last that Earl Harold and Sigurd Snap fell on Thorkel Fosterer and slew him. But when Earl Paul heard that, he took the tidings very ill, and gathered force together to him. But then the news came at once to Earl Harold, and he, too, drew force to him. But when the friends of both of them were aware of this, they came up and tried to settle matters, and then all men had a share in setting them at one again. Earl Paul was so wrath that he would hear of no terms, unless all those men were sent away who had been at the slaying. But inasmuch as it seemed to the freemen that great harm would come of their strife, then all men threw in their word that they should make friends. So it came about that Sigurd was sent away out of the Isles, and those other men whom Earl Paul thought were most guilty of the deed. Earl Harold paid up the fines that followed on Thorkel's slaying. It was also said of this peacemaking that the kinship of those brothers, Paul and Harold, should be bettered, and they were both to be together at Yule and all the other greatest high days. Sigurd Snap fared away out of the Orkneys, and up into Scotland, and dwelt there a while with Malcolm the Scot king in good cheer. And he was there thought to be the doughtiest man in all manly feats. He stayed for a time in Scotland ere he fared out to Jury. 58. It fell out once in the days of those brothers, Earl Harold and Earl Paul, that they were to keep the Yule feast at Orfer, in the house of Earl Harold, and he was to find the fare for both of them. He was busy there working hard and getting ready for the feast. Those sisters were there, Freycock and Helga, the Earl's mother, and they were sitting in the little room at their sewing. Then Earl Harold went into the room, but those sisters sat on the cross bench, and a new sewn linen shirt lay between them, white as driven snow. The Earl took up the shirt and saw that it was thickly stitched with gold. He asked, "Who owns this precious thing?" Freycock says, "'Tis meant for thy brother Paul." The Earl says, "Why work ye so hard at clothes for him? Ye do not take as much pains in making me clothes." The Earl was just risen up from his bed, and was only in a shirt and linen breeks, and had cast a cloak over his shoulders. He threw off the cloak and unfolded a linen shirt. His mother caught at it, and bade him not be envious, though his brother had good clothes. The Earl jerked it out of her hand, and got ready to put it on. Then they threw off their wimples and tore their hair, and said, "His life lay on it if he put on the shirt." They both then wept sore. The Earl put it on nevertheless, and let it fall down over him. But as soon as ever the cloth clung about his body, a shiver came over his skin, and straightway after that followed great pain. And from that the Earl took to his bed, and lay but a short while ere he breathed his last. That his friends thought great scathe. But at once after the death of Earl Harold, Earl Paul his brother took all the realm under him with the consent of all the freemen in the Orkneys. Earl Paul reckoned as if Freycock and her sister had meant that precious thing for him which Earl Harold had put on, and for that sake he would not have them live there in the Isles. Then they fared away with all their kith and kin, first to Caithness, and thence up into Sutherland, to those homesteads which Freycock owned there. There was reared up with her Len son of Harold the smooth-tongued, while he was a youngster. There, too, was reared up Oliver the unruly, the son of Thurljot of Rackwick, and of Steenver Freycock's daughter. Oliver was the tallest of men, and of very great strength, and wantonly quarrelsome, and a great manslayer. There too was reared up Thorbjorn the clerk, son of Thorstein the freeman, and Gudrun Freycock's daughter. There, too, was reared up Margaret, daughter of Earl Hakon and Helga Modon's daughter, and Eric Stabrails, Freycock's kinsman. These men were all of great family and great for their own sakes, and they all thought they had a great claim in the Orkneys to those realms which their kinsman Earl Harold had owned. The brothers of Freycock were Angus of the Open Hand, and Earl Otter in Thurso. He was a man of birth and rank. 59. Then Earl Paul ruled the Orkneys, and had very many friends. He was a man of few words, and no speaker at the things. He let many other men rule the land with him. The Earl was courteous and kind to all the land folk, liberal of money, and spared nothing to his friends. He was not fond of war, and sat much in quiet. There were then in the Orkneys many men of rank who were come from the stock of the Earls. There then dwelt at Westness, in Rousay, a man of rank, whose name was Sigurd. He had to wife Ingiborg the Honourable, but her mother's name was Herbjorg, daughter of Earl Paul Thorfinn's son. Their sons were these, Brynjulf and Hakon Pike. They were all chieftains of Earl Paul. The sons of Havard Gunny's son were also friends of Earl Paul, Magnus, and Hakon Claw, and Thorstein and Defnjall. Their mother was Bergeljot, but her mother was Ragnhilda, daughter of Earl Paul. Erling was the name of a man. He dwelt at Toncarns, in Hrossi. He had 4 sons, all of them proper men. Olaf was the name of a man, and he was Hrolf's son, who dwelt in Gursay. He had another house at Duncansby in Caithness. Olaf was a man of the greatest strength and power, and had great honours given him by Earl Paul. Asleif was the name of his wife. She was wise, and of great family, and was much thought of for her own sake. Weltoff was the name of one of their sons, Swain was another, a third Gunny. All these were tall and proper men. Their sister's name was Ingigerd. Sigurd Earl's father-in-law had to wife Thora, the mother of Magnus the Saint. Their son was Hakon Churl. That father and son were mighty chiefs. In Renancy dwelt that woman whose name was Ragna, a worthy housewife. Her son's name was Thorstein, a fine man of good parts. Kuji was the name of a householder in Wiskray, a wise man and wealthy, at Rapness. Helgi was the name of a householder, a man of worth and power, who lived there in Wiskray, in a thorp that was then there. Thorkel Flat was the name of a householder in Wiskray, cross-grained and high and mighty. Thorstein and Haflidi were his sons. They had not many friends. In Swinay in the Pentland Firth dwelt Grim, a man of small means. His sons were these, Asbjorn and Margad, the briskest of men. In the Fair Isle dwelt that man whose name was Bagfinn. Thorstein was the name of a man who dwelt at Flydrunes in Hrossi. His sons were Asbjorn Krukai and Blian. They were all unfriendly cross-grained men. Jadver, she was the bastard daughter of Erlerland, born of a thrall, dwelt at Narstead, and her son Borgar with her. They were not much beloved. John Wing dwelt in Hoyt the upland. Richard his brother dwelt at the Brinkenstransay. They were grand men, and kinsmen of Olaf Rolf's son. Grimkel was the name of a man who dwelt at Gleckness. These were all friends of Earl Paul, and all the people along with them. These men all come into the story afterwards. William was then Bishop of the Orkneys, and the bishop's seat was at Christchurch in Bursay. There then were wrought ever and anon great tokens from the holiness of Earl Magnus, when men watched over his tomb, but little stir was made about it because of the rule of Earl Paul. Bishop William too took the edge off of what men said about the tokens of Earl Magnus, and said it was great misbelief to go about with such things. Now we will first of all let the story stop a while, and rather say something of those glorious tokens which God hath granted for the worth's sake of Earl Magnus the Saint. 60. Bergfinskate's son was the name of a householder in Shetland, and he was blind. He brought 2 cripples south into the Orkneys. The name of the one was Sigurd and the other's Thorbjorn. They all watched over the tomb of Earl Magnus. To all of them Earl Magnus the Saint appeared, and gave them their health with God. And Bergfinn became so clear-sighted that he saw and knew his right hand from his left, but both the others stood straight up. But some time after, on the eve of the death day of Earl Magnus, 24 men in weak health watched over the tomb, and all got cured. Then many men craved that of the bishop, that he would let Earl Paul be spoken to, that he would give leave that the tomb should be searched and the halidim there looks of Earl Magnus taken up. The bishop took that heavily when it was said. It happened one summer that Bishop William fared east to Norway, and when he fared back he was late bound, and came to Shetland in autumn, a little before winter set in. Then foul weather arose and mighty storms, but the bishop could not bear to spend his time there, and was eager to get home. After that gales burst upon them, and the winter was come. Then the captain spoke to the bishop, and asked if he would vow for a fair wind not to say anything against taking up the heraldum of Earl Magnus. The bishop said yea to that, if the weather bettered, so that he might sing mass at home on the second Sunday at his bishop's seat. And as soon as ever that vow was fast made, the weather began to change, and came round to their mind, and they had a fair wind to the Orkneys, and such a quick wind that the bishop sung mass at home the next Sunday. But even when such things were granted to him, still he would not for all that believe in the holiness of Earl Magnus. Earl Paul too laid his displeasure on all those men who spread such stories about. This event happened in Christ Church at Bursay one day that the bishop went into the church, and was at his prayers. He was all alone in the church, but when he stood up and meant to go away, then he became blind, and could not find his way to the doors. He went about a long time seeking if he might get away. Then great fear fell upon him, and with that he fared to the tomb of Earl Magnus, and there prayed with tears, and vowed that he would take up the heraldum of Earl Magnus, whether Earl Paul liked it well or ill. And after that he got back his sight there over the tomb. After that the bishop sent to fetch to him all the most noble men in the Orkneys, and made it plain to them that he was ready then to search the tomb of Earl Magnus. And when it was dug into, the coffin was taken out of the ground. The bishop then let the bones be washed, and they were of a right fair hue. He let them take a knuckle bone, and proves it thrice in hallowed fire, and it burned not, but rather became of a hue as though it were gold. It is a story of some men that it had then run into the shape of a cross. Then many tokens were there wrought at the heraldum of Earl Magnus. Then the body was laid in a shrine and set over the altar. That was on St. Lucia's day. He had then lain in the mould 21 winters. Then it was taken as law that each day should be kept holy, the day that he was taken up and the day of his death. The heraldum of Earl Magnus was kept there for some time. It happened once that a man dreamed a dream in West Ray, whose name was Gunny, a good yeoman, that Magnus the saint came to him and said to him, This shalt thou say to Bishop William, that my will is to fare away from Bursay and east to Kirkwall. And I trow that Almighty God will grant me of his mercy that those men shall be healed of their ailments who seek thither past hope of cure with right faith. This dream shalt thou boldly tell. But when Gunny awoke it came all at once into his mind that he must not tell the dream, for that he was afraid that Earl Paul would lay his displeasure on him. But the next night after Earl Magnus showed himself to him when he slumbered, he was in very wrath and said, Thou shalt fare to Bursay and tell thy dream when most men are by. But if thou farest not, thou shalt have punishment for it in this world and more in the other world. Then Gunny woke and was full of fear, and fared at once until he came to Bursay to tell his dream before all the people at Mass. And Earl Paul was there and many other mighty men. Then many begged that the bishop would set about it and bear the heraldum east to Kirkwall as the Earl had revealed. Earl Paul held his peace as though he had water in his mouth, and turned as red as blood. After that Bishop William fared east to Kirkwall with a gallant company, and fleeted thither the heraldum of Earl Magnus, and they set the shrine over the high altar in the church. At that time the market town at Kirkwall had few houses. Then many signs and tokens were straightway wrought there. A little after Berg Finskady's son fared from the north from Shetland the second time to watch over the heraldum of Earl Magnus, and had with him his leprous son, whose name was Halfdan. Earl Magnus appeared to both of them, and passed his hands over them, and then Halfdan was made thoroughly whole. But Bergfinn got back his sight, so that he became a sharp-sighted man. Amundi was the name of a man from the north of Shetland. He had leprosy over all his body. He fared to Kirkwall, and watched at the shrine of Earl Magnus the Saint, and prayed for help and health for himself. But the holy servant of God, Earl Magnus, showed himself to him as he slumbered, and passed his hands over all his body, and when he awoke he was whole and well, and knew no ailment anywhere. And all praised God and Earl Magnus the Saint. Thorkel was a man's name who kept house in the Orkneys. He fell down from off his barley stack right down to the ground, and was all crushed on one side. He was brought to the shrine of the blessed Earl Magnus, and there he got back his health. Sigurd was the name of a man from the north out of Fetlar. His hand was cramped, so that all his fingers lay in the palm. He fared to Kirkwall, and was there made whole. Thorbjorn was the name of a man, but Girth was the name of his father. He was from Shetland, and was mad, and was brought to Earl Magnus, and became straightway whole. Thord was the name of a man whose nickname was Dragon Shot. He was Bergfinn's hireling of Shetland. He thrashed corn from the hom in the barley barn the next day before St. Lucia's and St. Magnus' Day. But when the daylight began to change, then Bergfinn the master went out thither into the barn and bade him strike off work. Thord says, "It doesn't often happen that thou thinkest I work over long." Bergfinn said, "Tomorrow is St. Magnus' Day, which we ought to hold with all such honor as we best can." Then Bergfinn went away, but Thord worked still as hard as he could. But when a short time had gone by, then Bergfinn went a second time, and spoke to Thord in mickle wrath, and said he thought there was spite in that thou workest now at holy tides. And now leave off at once. Then Bergfinn went away in a rage. But Thord worked on as before. But when men had sat down to the board, and had eaten and were full, Thord came in his workaday clothes, just when men took to drinking, and began to drink at once. But when he had drained one full cup, then he lost his wits at once and got wild, so that men had to hold him and to put him into bonds, and so it went on for 3 days and nights. Then Bergfinn vowed for him to give half a mark of silver to the shrine of Earl Magnus, and to let Thord watch for 3 nights, if he might become whole. But Thord became whole on that night, on the evening of which the vow had just been made. 2 men took gold from the shrine of Earl Magnus, one an Orkney and the other a Caithness man. The Caithness man was lost in the Pentland Firth. His name was Gilly. The Orkney man went mad, and said in his fits what they had done, and then a vow was made for him to go on a pilgrimage south, if he might be made whole at the shrine of Earl Magnus. Now he was brought thither and became whole at once. Ogmund was the name of a Shetlander on whose head a crossbeam fell and crushed his skull much, but Bergfinn vowed for him, and cast lots whether the vow should be to go south on a pilgrimage, or to set a slave free, or to give money to Earl Magnus' shrine if he were made whole. But the lot turned up to give money for Earl Magnus' shrine. But the lot turned up to give money for Earl Magnus' shrine, and there he became whole. But Bergfinn, his mother's brother, gave half a mark as he had vowed. Sigurd's daughter was the name of a woman from the north out of Shetland, who was blind from childhood and until she was 20. Then her father went with her to Earl Magnus, and let her watch there, and gave much goods to the shrine of Magnus, and there she got her sight. Sigurd was again the name of a woman from Shetland whose leg broke into bits. She was taken to Magnus, and she got back there her health. Sigrid was the name of a third woman from the north out of Shetland in the island of Unst. She was with Thorlak, who kept house at Baltasted. She sewed when other men left off work on the eve of Earl Magnus' Mass. But Thorlak asked why she worked so long. She said she would leave off there and then. He went away, but she sewed on as before. Then Thorlak went a second time, and asked why she did so ill. "And away with thee," he says, "and don't work in my house." She said she had only a little bit unsewn, and worked on as before until it got dark, and she sate in her place. But when fires were made, and men busked them to eating and drink, then she fell mad and was thrown into bonds, and she was mad until Thorlak vowed a vow for her. he cast lots whether the vow should be a pilgrimage south, or setting a slave free, or giving money to the shrine of Earl Magnus the Saint, but the lot came up to give money to Earl Magnus' shrine. Thorlak brought her thither, and there she became whole, and went south afterwards. In England were two men who staked much money on casting of dice, and one of them had already lost a large sum. Then he staked a ship of burden and all that he had against all that he had already lost. But the other man threw first 2 sixes. Then that man thought things looked badly for him, and called on Earl Magnus the Saint that he might not lose all that he had, and then threw his throw. But one of the dice burst asunder, and there turned up 2 sixes and an ace, and he gained all that lay upon the throw, and after that he gave Earl Magnus much goods. Groa was a woman's name in Hrossey. She became raving mad, and was brought to Earl Magnus the Saint, and got there her health, and was there all her life after and praised God. Sigurd was the name of a man. He was Tand's son, he kept house north in Shetland, he became devil mad, and was sewn up in a hide, and was brought afterwards from the north to Kirkwall to Earl Magnus the Saint, and there he got back his health. And all praised God who were by and his holy bosom friend Earl Magnus. Now is done telling here of those glorious tokens which God grants for the sake of Saint Magnus the Isle Earl. Now also we must make an end of these stories with this prayer, that he who wrote this saga, and he who dictated it, and everyone who listened to it, may have intercession and help in their prayers from the holy knight of God Earl Magnus, to the absolution of their sins and to everlasting joy. But of our Almighty Lord Jesus Christ may they have help and mercy, peace and joy, both now and forever, from him who is and was and shall be, one true and everlasting God, granting and willing and mighty to give all good things forever and ever. Amen. 1. The Danish translation here adds he did not go into the church for any other reason than that he wished to preserve his life. Sick. There he made his prayers heartily to God, and commended himself into his hands. Early the morning after he went out of the church, and 2 others with him by another way down to the shore into a secret place, and then said his prayers again to God. 2. The Danish translation adds, that he shall have one's weapons and clothes who puts him to death. 3. This date is wrong. To agree with the others it should be 1116. 4. Instead of this sentence the translation runs thus. Wise men say that in the spring after they should have been set at one, Thora, the mother of Magnus, had bidden them both to be her guests. And they were to come straightway to her when they were reconciled, and came back from Egil's Isle. 5. Florid adds, until his worthiness was so plainly revealed that God let his holiness wax higher in the same proportion as it was more tried, as is said in his book of tokens and wonders. 6. Beitling, that is, the little bit tiny. 7. Florida reads, then Freycock threw off her wimple and tore her hair. 8. Earl Paul, that is, of Earl Paul I, grandfather of Earl Paul Hakon's son. 9. Rinensey, North Ronaldsey. 10. Comp, above ch. 55, and Isle. Anne, under the year 1168. 11. St. Lucia's Day, Comp. Maine, Essia Jarls, ch. 31, and ch. 54 above. 12. Baltasted for Balaslead in the MS, which would answer to the neighborhood of the present Baltasound in Unst.